This week I'm joined by Silviya Serafimova, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at the European Institutes for Advanced Studies. In this episode, part 1 of 2, we discuss the philosophy of Peter Wessel Zapffe, especially his philosophy of Biosophy, cosmic panic, Dionysian mountaineering, and his notable pessimism. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you'd like to support the podcast as it runs off donations and patronage alone, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. Okay, so Silviya Serafimova, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
We are going to be discussing the work of Peter Wessel Zapffe, who most people will know via his short, about 10-page text, The Last Messiah. Outside of this, this is in the English-speaking world. Outside of this, in the English, in English, there is very few things. People may also have heard of his work via Thomas Ligotti's The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. However, if you dig deep in a way, I am sort of privileged to speak to yourself, and we are going to be speaking about Zapffer's work from your own book, which is entitled In Search of the Universe's Helpless Captive, A Glimpse to Peter Wessel Zapffer's Philosophical Heritage, which was published 2019 by Avantgarde Prima, I believe. And this alongside this, the glimpse to the philosophical heritage, it also gives just an astounding, it's a very long book in a great way. It's a great book, highly technical, really does situate Zapffe in, deeply rooted in philosophy, and helps you understand his pessimism, which is why people are often drawn to him. And yeah, I'm so happy to finally find someone to speak in depth about Zapffe. So before we jump in with everything, just tell us a little bit about yourself. What it is you do, and how it was you came to write this book.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here, and hope I'll manage just to show some things regarding Zapffer's brilliant philosophical heritage. I'm associate professor at the Department of Ethical Studies at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, and my background is in ethics. So I have published in different areas of ethics, including Scandinavian ethics, environmental ethics, machine ethics, and meta-ethics. So almost 10 years ago, I decided to write a book on Norwegian environmental philosophy. And at that time, I knew merely the works of Arne Næss, one of Norway's best-known philosophers. But the more I read, the more I realized that there are two underappreciated philosophers in the shade of Arne Næss, namely Sigmund Kvaluis Setrent, and I think that this is the other person who probably also deserves a podcast, at least in my point of view, and Peter Wessel Zapffe. So I believe that he's one of the most thought-provoking philosophers of the 20th century, who masters great knowledge and philosophical creativity in many incomparable at first sight spheres. So hopefully he finally gets his very deserved place in the contemporary philosophical discourse. So these two philosophers made me change my mind and write about Norwegian environmental philosophies in plural, since it turned out that Norwegian environmental philosophy is not a homogeneous phenomenon. Specifically in this book, I had 2 chapters on Zapffe, and probably I would like to share something more about the first part, which was probably much more interesting than the second part, which is devoted to Biosophy, and we'll have much more time to discuss it here. So the first part, or the first chapter, was devoted to Zapffer's mountaineering experience, which, in my point of view, provides the philosophical grounding of a new ethics of climbing versus that of alpinism as a sport. It might sound a bit, trendy and a bit exotic, but I will try to figure out to what extent this kind of new ethics of climbing actually underlines the new Norwegian environmental philosophies in plural. So let me start probably with Zapffer's famous saying, climbing to other sports is like champagne to bog beer. And it turned into a slogan for the Norwegian Climbing Club, which represents the spirit of this, as Peder Anker coins it, upper crust fraternity. However, Zapffe himself was not easily accepted in the club, regardless of his well-established reputation as a climber. And the application to the Norwegian Alpine Club was written almost as an anti-application. In it, he spoke ironically of his climbing activities, which was the reason to be rejected by the club's members. And almost 15 years later, when the club sent him another invitation to join, Zapffe thanked them and replied, in the following manner. So I will allow myself just to quote briefly some of his words. Mm-hmm. So I think that they're illuminative for this kind of shift in environmental philosophy, which could be coined by a methodological oxymoron called transcendental existentialism. So for that matter, mountain climbing isn't a sport at all. It is a Dionysian affirmation of life. It is the poor creeping human's encounter with the ruffled skull on the face of the earth, a Dante's journey along the jaws of the Inferno, a stroke of arcing life over the silence born of stone. In turn, this kind of vision provoked Ardennes to say that Zapfe's creative manner of writing can be described somehow as a climbing blues. So, as you can see, it sounds a bit fancy, a bit exotic, but it seems to me that here we can find the reasons of a new ethics, which is very particular for the Norwegian environmental philosophies in general. Why is it so? Because my hypothesis is that Zapffe, together with Ness and Niels Farlund, paved the way for a new ethics of climbing, and this ethics promotes the trackless experience in the mountains rather than the competition as a way of conquering the peak, which makes the mountain an arena of sports activities. And here it seems to me that the transformative power of this new ethics can be exemplified by revealing how Homo ascensus, or the climbing person, turns into a Homo viator, the walking person, as well as how adopting its principles within the Norwegian environmental philosophies makes room for recognizing a new ontologically determined experience of interacting with nature. So, as an example of the practical implications of this new ethics, I would point out probably the beginning of a tradition marked by Zapfe's refusal the peaks to be named after the one who has climbed them first. Although Zapffe himself, as I already pointed out, has climbed many summits in Norway for the first time. And ironically enough, a few years before he passed away in 1987, the highest peak of a Hollendaren in Kvaløya was named after him. So this is something which was probably quite against his visions. So why is this new ethics so important for the 20th century Norwegian environmental philosophies? Because I believe that the value of this trackless experience was gradually implemented and developed into the so-called anti-expeditions. In 1971, Niels Farlund, Sigmund Kvaløy Sætreng, the guy I mentioned in the beginning, and Ardennes set out on an anti-expedition to Nepal to help the local Sherpa people in their campaign to protect the sacred mountain Tsarigma from the tourist mountaineers. And during that trip, Ness completed the sketch of a new environmental philosophy, and this is the famous philosophy Ecosophy T. And of course, here there are lots of interpretations what T means. According to some interpretations, this is the first letter of the Norwegian word for interpretation, tolkning, or it's named after Ness mountain, Fjallstein. Kvaløy, in turn, the second guy, formulated the principles of ecopolitics as a life necessity society, as opposed to the dominant industrial development society. And Niels Farlund was inspired to continue his philosophy of outdoor life, friluftsliv, as a wider approach to outdoor education. So briefly, just to sum it up here, I was very impressed by the way in which Zapffe influenced the development of Norwegian environmental philosophies by introducing this kind of very interesting ethics of climbing, with very particular existential grounding, which is quite unusual compared to the rest parts of the world. So going back to the ideas of Zapffe as explained in my book, in the second chapter, I've been trying to write something about Zapfe's unique theory of biosophy. But considering that we'll talk about this issue in detail, I'll just try to summarize the gist of the idea as follows. So Kvaløy himself describes Zapffe as a Buddhist minus nirvana. And I think that it's a brilliant description. Probably I can try to show why he's so controversial, but at the same time, his genius spirit actually is intrinsically tied with this kind of controversial points of his philosophy. So basically, we cannot describe him in any other matter than just saying that he's a brilliant thinker who cannot be described with something traditional as a definition. And in my turn, I would just try to speculate a bit with this definition. I would say that biosophy is biosemiotics plus existentialism. So hopefully later we will manage somehow to clarify this issue. Mm-hmm. So I finished this book I decided that I can write another one in which I can try to systemize and analyze some of Zapfe's main ideas in the fields of Biosophy, Tragic, heroism, morality, aesthetics, catastrophe, and philosophy of religion. So, as you mentioned in the beginning of the interview, this book was supposed to give the reader a glimpse of Zapfe's philosophical heritage, mainly by outlining the rich intellectual context in which his ideas took place. So, generally speaking, I strongly believe that Zapfe's brilliant philosophical heritage is an example not only of a good, so to speak, interdisciplinarity, since he demonstrates a broad and very deep knowledge about many philosophical traditions he refers to, but also of unique interdisciplinarity, combining methods and theories of incomparable at first sight fields. And just for instance, he applies methods of logic in the field of literary criticism, which sounds quite unusual, methods of the so-called cultural pathological paradox in the philosophy of religion, the methods of applied biology into the scope of existential philosophy, etc. So hopefully I can manage to show, or at least partly to show, the uniqueness of some of his intellectual intuitions as embodied into different theories, as well as embodied into different intellectual contexts.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, just out of interest with relation to the ethics of climbing, are you yourself a mountaineer now? Have you?
Yeah.
Oh wow! So do you? I mean, trying not to divert from the questions too much here, but do you try to take that approach when you climb mountains? Are you a Zapffian climber?
Yeah, in a sense. Unfortunately, I'm not as good as Zapffe is because I this kind of practical experience, and he has been very extraordinary in terms of mastering different skills and stuff. Also, it's very important when we're arguing about climbing philosophy that the introduction of different techniques of climbing in no way actually has changed the way of interacting in nature, so that different philosophical influences have been introduced. For instance, there are this kind of techniques of bolt climbing and clean climbing, and through these techniques, different philosophical influences have been introduced into Norway. For instance, German philosophy, French philosophy, and this has been somehow implemented into particular ways of interacting with the mountain itself, so as the trackless experience to gain a particular value, the value of non-invasion, the value of interacting with nature as if we are part of it, not just the conquerors of nature as such. So, of course, regarding every single climbing tradition, we can say that probably it's not very unique in terms of this kind of slowly changing interaction with nature, but the particular Norwegian context is very specific. And also another thing which I consider is very important is that this kind of techniques, which are practice related, absolutely, no doubt about that, they have actually triggered the development of very diverse philosophies under the umbrella of Norwegian environmental philosophy, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And important because all these kind of philosophers, not only Zapffe, but also Arnenes, Niels Farwund, all of them have had this kind of practical experience, practical philosophy. If we go back to the ancient Greek tradition, so probably we can say that this is something like a particular type of phronesis of climbing, practical wisdom, so to speak. And I was very interested in this kind of point. And then, of course, it helped me to broaden my horizon about Norwegian philosophy in general, because you can follow different intuitions, different concepts, which have been actually developed as a part of this, so to speak, climbing experience in time.
I just want to stay on that for one thing because I'm quite intrigued there. So the Norwegian experience is as you say, the free climb, the non-invasiveness. How would you define a French style of mountain climbing?
Well. Of course, a very broad topic. It's difficult probably to comment on this because I'm not an expert in this, but I think that it has much to do with a different way of interacting with nature in general. And to a certain extent, I would also say, because of course I have much more experience about Norwegian techniques of climbing, at least theoretically, not so much as a mountaineer, but it seems to me that also this kind of trackless experience and non-invasive experience, if you wish, has been developed in time in different manners. Because in the beginning, it was only the human and the mountain. Then, of course, we can see the climax of the philosophical influence there, where people have been trying actually to practice climbing as a Dionysian booze, as Ness coined it. Well, it seems to me that probably French way of climbing is underlined by different type of philosophical intuitions and also attitudes towards nature as such. Another interesting thing is that, at least in Norwegian environmental philosophy and Norwegian climbing philosophy in particular, that while in the beginning, as I said, the philosophical influence was somehow mediated by the particular techniques of climbing, then there was a time in the late 70s when Norwegian climbing clubs, to a particular extent, went back to the sports activities of alpinism. I mean, it was not this kind of romantic vision that they suddenly realized that nature is wonderful when we should introduce this kind of trackless experience. There was lots of mixture of Western influences also in terms of sportifying climbing. And it was a very, very broad topic, and also very painful topic for many philosophers, because in the beginning they have been trying to introduce this kind of philosophy as practice. And then it turned out that these good intentions were kind of, let's say, deteriorating due to the westernization of climbing as a sport. So it's not a homogeneous, let's say, trend either. And it seems to me that probably there are some similarities between what you mentioned about French traditions and Norwegian traditions, are that they are not homogeneous tendencies as such. And we can see particular type of influence of philosophical, but also of purely, let's say, practical ideas related to sport and competition and all these kind of impulses which have been driving the development of climbing as a sport. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I managed to somehow answer to your question.
No, absolutely, yeah.
I'm not an expert in this area, I mean, in terms of climbing as such, but it seems to me that, the similarity is this kind of, can be found in this kind of broader perspective when philosophy is mixed with pretty practical impulses, influences, which have nothing to do with philosophy. And it's always a matter of some kind of existential tension between the practice as a philosophical practice and practice as a sport practice.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, before we jump further into the ideas of Zapffe, I have to ask you the Hermetics question, but I imagine you've probably already answered it. You can place three thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Zapffe is already there. Who do you pick? I'm going to assume that Arne Ness is going to be one of these.
Sorry for disappointing you. It seems to me that I've chosen some other people because we're interested in this kind of contemporary projections of hubris in philosophy. So I'm afraid that while Zapffe can participate in a conversation with many thinkers having a quite different background, as I will try to show, only few of them can manage to have a rich talk with them. And here I have somehow, let's say, I myself would be interested to hear what Zapffe can say to some researchers such as Julian Savulescu, Ingmar Persson, and Thomas Douglas, specifically about Persson and Savulescu's project of moral bioenhancement, according to which the use of biomedical technologies can morally improve individuals, and Douglas' project of neural enhancement, saying that voluntarily undergoing moral desirability of neural enhancements would often be morally permissible. Why is this so important? Because I'm curious, what would be Zapfe's response to such projects, considering that his philosophical system is grounded in preserving the existential tension of tragic, which characterizes the human condition and cosmic feeling of panic in particular. So on the one hand, we have this kind of vision, Zapfe's vision of human modus vivendi as you mentioned at the beginning, universe is helpless captive, and its quotation, which I have borrowed from Zapffe. While on the other hand, we have moral bioenhancement, neural enhancement projects considered as a guarantee of moral perfection. So the question is, do we need this kind of moral perfection, which deprives human nature of this existential tension, its initial fragility, as well as the value of feeling, cosmic feeling of panic? So the perfection, since, as I said in the beginning, my background is in ethics, so I have serious problems with this kind of idea of perfection, which in my point of view is not equivalent to the idea of perfectibility. Mm-hmm. Because perfection as such is not the same as moral development. And these enhancements, as defined, so to speak, by moral bioenhancement and neural enhancement, they deprived individuals of what makes them human, specifically of the process of moral and social self-development, including making mistakes, and the negative moral experience in general. So, considering that the last part of Zapfe's fundamental work on the tragic, and I think that most of the ideas, of course, of the early essay, The Last Messiah, have been incorporated into this masterpiece, philosophical masterpiece, I would say. Mm-hmm. I devoted to tragic in literature and dramaturgy, as well as considering that in the ancient Greek tragedy, the excess of pride causes the transgressor's ruin in the end, hubris. So I think that here we can compare two different worldviews. The first worldview is the worldview of hubris, as displayed by this kind of projects which I mentioned above. So I'm tempted to counter the hubris of moral bio and neural enhancement with the human courage, and here I should quote Zapffe, to strip human soul naked, as is written in the end of Last Messiah. And another interesting point, which probably is not very related to this kind of question, but I think that maybe it would be interesting just to say a few words about this, is that the last Messiah is never the last one. And it's also very interesting when we are trying to read Zapfe's messages, because he's the last one only here and now. And he's part of the future, and here I again quote Zapffe, nightmare of endless repetition, a breach of life which gradually gains its unity again. And at the very end of the essay, Zapffe says, he's the last Messiah. Like a father's son, he is descendant of the hunter by the waterhole. One night in long bygone times, man awoke and saw himself. He saw that he was naked on the cosmos, homeless in his own body. All things dissolved before his testing thought, wonder above wonder, horror above horror, unfolded in his mind. So I think that if we are going in this direction of practicing and developing this kind of moral hubris, actually we'll lose this kind of feeling of being homeless in our own body, and losing this kind of initial value of fragility of human existence. Actually, we will lose our human nature. That's why I would be interested to see how Zapffe can respond to such kind of project. Of course, this is a pure speculation, and I'm sure that he would be very critical. But I feel that we need this kind of healthy cosmic feeling of panic in order to preserve somehow the human in our human condition, and more importantly, in our human nature.
Mm. So it's interesting there. That room actually is very helpful, because it seems to me that in relation to the mountaineering, to the ethics and the morality, and also bringing it back down to the human body, you see Zapffe as a very practical philosopher. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that it's just I think most appreciations of him, at least in English, via The Last Messiah. I mean, this isn't something you would see. So do you think it's key to view him in that way?
Mm-hmm. I think that what is very important in this context is to emphasize that Zapfe's philosophy is very complex. On the one hand, it could be read as a very abstract philosophy, because when we looked at it step by step, we can discern particular philosophical influences which are sometimes incomparable in between. He uses very complex, very effective metaphors. He operates with a quite broad set of ideas, values, and stuff. At the same time, when we have been thinking about this kind of intellectual controversies into his text, we can figure out some kind of very fundamental messages. And I think that they're fundamental because they are practice related, but not in the sense of being, very practically identifiable. But practice related in the sense that when we are doing philosophy, we are doing as a philosophical practice, which is oriented towards humans as beings which have a soul and body. And here, what I consider is very important in this kind of investigations is that he emphasizes the fragility of human condition, but he's not a nihilist. He's rather what I could say provocative pessimist. And he also tries to figure out that necessary tragic in particular, is not something bad for humans as such, but this is something as a constructive trigger for our human condition, just to be able to ask again and again the question, what does it mean to be a human? And in this sense, I think that you are absolutely right. The practice-oriented question is, what does it mean to be a human? But of course, it's not a question which can be answered in practice alone. And I think that this is the interesting ontological tension behind Zapffel's way of thinking and developing ideas.
So just to stay on that for a little while, or one further question, because this is a big push happening at the moment, especially with the work of a man named Brian Johnson, who's trying to extend his life, biologically and you could say physically. Do you think that's sort of this notion of this room of people who are, bioextension or sort of an abuse of what the human body is with respect to its limitation? Do you think that's really a way to avoid the cosmic panic, which we haven't really defined yet, but that way of bolstering solely the hedonism or the pleasure feeling or the physicality of the body, that's wrong-founded because it's purely quantified. There's no quality there. There's no question of existential questioning.
Absolutely, and I think that we can see some points in Zapffel's own theory, because in the beginning he argues that we have 4 types of interests: biological, social, autotelic. This is an interesting category. These are the interests which have the objective, they are objective in themselves. They are, in a sense, some kind of methodologically self-sufficient interest, and metaphysical interest. So here we have this kind of taxonomy. But the main reason for why we have humans as such complex beings is that we have multi-frontal conflicts based on these multiple interests. So in life, we rarely see only biological or only social interests. We see biological social interests, metaphysical biological interests. We have this kind of hybrid types of interests. And what is very important for Zapffe, and I think that it's relevant for what you said, is that these multi-frontal interests, they trigger multi-frontal conflicts, but also multi-frontal engagements. So when we're arguing about this kind of bioextension, it seems to me that we are trying somehow to reduce the multi-frontal conflicts. But doing so, we are not aware that actually we reduce multi-frontal engagements as well. So we are limiting our engagements with the world, just looking for some kind of particular type of security, believing that if we just reduce and simplify the conflicts, we will somehow enhance our nature as human beings. But actually, while doing so, we are simply missing this kind of multifrontality of engagements with the world. And in this way, and in this sense, we are somehow narrowing our worldview horizons. And I think that this is the great danger. And I also think that the cosmic feeling of panic actually addresses this kind of issues, because if we somehow find an answer to the question, what does it mean to be a human here and now? Actually, we lose our human unfixability, our ability to be engaged again and again with the world as a matter of a never-ending question.
That's an extremely articulate critique of that form of thinking, that bioextension form of thinking, which I think they need to understand. Especially perhaps if it works out for them and they get to about 130 or 140 years old, then they probably will understand it anyway, because I don't feel humans are really meant to live that long in a way. I would just throw in interviews with humans who have really grown very old. The oldest humans, most of them are very bored. But there you go. But one thing I want, I guess, to lay a foundation before we jump forward into Biosophy and in relation, the conversation that we've been having there in relation to biology, I do want to just sort of lay a foundation of Zapffel's influences, his philosophical influences, because they are, when I was reading your book, if you were to just read The Last Messiah, and I want to sort of, I keep going back to it because it will be, I think, most people's sort of anchor, and I think just reading that text as great as it is, and as you said, it is a masterpiece, you wouldn't get the impression of the influences that he has, because they are a very strange mixture of influences.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. So I've been trying somehow to sort out the influences field by field, and also to try to pick a few points which might give you an idea what was the influence, which was actually somehow internalized in a particular and unique way by Zapffe. So you're quite right when you say that it's difficult. You see that there is an influence, but on the other hand, it's very difficult to trace the origin and the genealogy of this influence. So it's very interesting, at least for the people who read Norwegian. There is an essay which is called How I Became So Clever, and this is an essay written by Zapffe. So in this essay, he gives an idea how he himself reflects upon the development of his own personality in time, starting with his high school years, his struggle with one of the two language standards of Norwegian, landsmål, which was later called Nynorsk, his decision to study law, going through the gradually growing interest in Norwegian literature, Ibsen in particular, and literary criticism in general, and ending up with the intellectual, institutional challenges and personal concerns about the completion of his work on the tragic as a Ph.D. thesis. This is also a very interesting essay because Zapffe is very illuminative for his self-irony. And it is also full of metaphors and different influences. So it's more or less like solving a puzzle to figure out what and who he is talking about. An interesting point, just to say a few words about on the tragic, is that at the beginning it was supposed to be submitted as a PhD thesis in literature. But after its first rejection and under the influence of Ness, it was revised and submitted as a PhD in philosophy. And the main objective of this piece was to clarify what does it mean to be a human, as I mentioned earlier. So, faithful to his self-ironic style, Zapffe writes at the end of the essay How I Became So Clever, the following, and I will just briefly read it. Just a very small self-ironic clearance between the professional and the human will secure them both against a painful retrospect when one day their strength runs out. In the light of the enigma of existence, any science that has cut the umbilical cord to the cosmic mother problem will become parodic when placed next to the soulless body of the scientist. So it sounds a bit scary, I would say, in a sense. So situating Zapffe in the history of philosophy is not an easy task, nor is a homogeneous task in itself, because, as I said, he has been working in many philosophical fields. And that's why I will try just briefly to summarize a few things field by field. Regarding Biosophy, this kind of unique philosophy which we are going to talk about, I would say that, of course, Zapffe is influenced by Jakob von Uexküll's theory of biosemiotics, which is seen as philosophically tied with Berkeley's principle esse est percipi, the famous principle to be is to be perceived, and even with Protagoras' view that human is a measure of everything, homo mensura. This is something which Zapffe articulates by himself. So Zapffe finds Uexküll's contribution in how he recognizes the development of organic life as evaluated from the perspective of the fight of interests, these four interests which I just mentioned. And this clarification refers specifically to Zapfe's understanding of Biosophy as a method. And here I raise this kind of hypothesis that it's very difficult to define Biosophy, and we can argue for Biosophy as a method, as a theory, and as a philosophy, but probably we can have time to discuss this later. So regarding morality, and considering that Zapffe defines four types of morality corresponding to the four interest fronts, biological, social, totemic, and metaphysical, it seems to me that what I call Zapfe's experiential morality, corresponding to his view of heterotelic metaphysical type of morality, is partly influenced, this is my suggestion, by the father of experimental psychology, Johannes Müller, physiology, Johannes Müller, specifically by his conception of fulfillment regarding how one looks for confirmation's fulfillment by the way of perfection. And of course, the more apparent parallel is that between Zapfe's theory of empathy and Schopenhauer's conception of compassion, in the part that the just person can be distinguished from the good person by the way they show compassion. Specifically, some parallels can be drawn between Schopenhauer's idea of the sacrifice of the good person alleviating the suffering of others and Zapfe's vision of the embodiment of sacrifice in the context of heroism. His vision of heroism is also very interesting, and he introduces two types of heroism. Unfortunately, probably we won't have time to talk about this, original and unoriginal heroism. And it's very important to see what kind of motivation lays behind this kind of distinction. And it's also very interestingly interpreted into the field of the so-called poetic tragic by Zapffe. Consequently, the parallels with Schopenhauer continue in terms of pessimism. Probably these are the most well-known parallels. However, I would like to emphasize that Zapffe criticizes Schopenhauer's view of tragic in particular. And Zapfe's criticism is embedded into what he coins value pessimism. And this is a world pessimism related to different types of catastrophes in time. In addition, Zapffe builds a very innovative taxonomy of pessimism, which is partly influenced by Arnold Kovalevsky's monograph Studies in Psychology of Pessimism. And going back to the idea of heroism, I think that Kovalevsky monograph also plays a crucial role in Zapfe's theory of heroism, together with Gustav Höfding's work, The History of the Newer Philosophy. The taxonomy of pessimism is of crucial importance because it is closely tied with Zapfe's two fundamental concepts of tragic. Objective tragic, determined as a destruction of the physical possibility for a fight, and poetic tragic. Regarding poetic tragic, Zapffe is under the influence of the Finnish philosopher and professor of aesthetics Yrjö Hirn, from whom he borrowed the concept of autotelic, this kind of third type of interest I talked about in the beginning, the interest which has the objective, its own objective in itself. However, in contrast to Hirn, Zapffe claims that one poem can be tragic without having a poetic value for a given bystander. And here, I'll just briefly point out a few interesting parallels, and I think that they're very illuminative for the way we can draw comparisons between Zapffe and Nietzsche. Elaborating upon Nietzsche's conception of Dionysian and Apollonian, Zapffe argues for two types of bystanders while applying Jung's theory of the different personalities. Specifically, Zapffe claims that Apollonian people are, and here I'll quote, extrovert, extensive natures who are also contemplative, partly involved in the piece of art. While Dionysian people are introvert, intensive natures, they are participating by getting fully involved into the piece of art. And an interesting example in this context is Zapfe's analysis of Antigone as a tragic hero. Regarding poetic tragic, Zapffe considers Beethoven and Wagner as illuminative examples of how music mediates tragic, while Munch's famous work, The Scream, is examined as a masterpiece of what he calls artistic greatness. And he also discusses the poetic tragic course in Ibsen's play A Doll's House. So these are not just theoretical speculations, but they are also implemented when Zapffe analyzes famous or not so famous pieces of art. On the other hand, the idea of poetic tragic is implemented, and I think that this is very important and interesting topic in itself, into Zapfe's philosophy of religion. So together with Jesus, Ibsen's Brand, from the same name play, is probably the character to whom Zapffe refers most frequently in his works. And I argue that Brand can be interpreted as a prototype of the image of Jesus as displayed in Zapfe's play, The Prodigal Son, and his last monograph, God's Kingdom. So Zapffe refers to some authors who discuss the reliability of Jesus' historicity by both adopting and transforming their arguments within the framework of liberal theology. But this is just the very basic framework. So in the preface of God's Kingdom, Zapffe mentions not only some supporters of liberal theology, such as Dietrich Nielsen, but also some opponents of liberal theology, such as Frederick Thorn. Among the supporters of the conception of Jesus' historicity, Zapffe mentions the names of Wolfgang Beilner, Christian Druss, Georg Brandes, Jakub Jervel, and I only named some of these doctors and opponents of liberal theology because, at least in my point of view, Zapffe builds a very unique cosmogony. His philosophy of religion is interpreted, at least in my point of view, as a particular type of very modern cosmogony. So according to this cosmogony, the image of God as an omnipotent demiurge has been replaced by what Zapffe calls the God from the cyclotron, and what in turn I would call an successful dramaturge of one universe where humans as interest bearers are doomed to experience this never-ending cosmic feeling of panic. It's a very interesting topic. Quite modern in terms of interpretations and methods which Zapffe adopts. So just briefly want to point out that this is a topic which deserves attention in itself. And last but not least, so probably it will sound a bit like a gossip sharing, but considering that Zapffe makes his philosophical reputation as a logician, probably I should say something about his work in Logic, although unfortunately I'm not an expert in this field. But the history and probably the gossips behind the way in which he has been interacting with Arne Næss at the last years of his life is very illuminative for the role of some intellectual influences in a philosophical context. So in 1966, Zapffe wrote the book The Logic Sandbox, Elementary Logic for University Studies and Self-Studies, which became, let's say, the last drop in the relations between him and Arne Næss. After over 10 years of negotiations, Næss finally managed to convince Zapffe to write a textbook together, which is called Some Elementary Topics in Logic. According to Zapffe, the result was a nightmare, and the common work is described as, and I quote, deadly, paralyzing, blocking every single logical eros which had to emerge at the beginning of the initiative. In 1964, Zapffe proposed a chapter to the publisher called Selected Elementary Topics in Logic and Semantics. He examines the same topics which were discussed by Næss in his textbook, but analyzed in completely different manner. And this was the reason for Zapffe to insist on using his textbook as an alternative to Næss one. And of course, the publisher did not want an alternative compendium, and that is why it was published 2 years later. There were some kind of complicated situations. Zapffe was furious that Næss wanted the text to be simplified by adding a list of the concepts at the end of the textbook. In addition, the complicated style of Zapfe's textbook became a reason for the very weak sales, which is understandable in a sense when we're talking about students. And the gossip is that Zapffe felt betrayed by Næss, believing that he has not helped him enough, while Næss was strongly convinced that Zapffe has not understood his good intentions. And for over 10 years, no one managed to convince Zapffe to accept Næss Christmas cards. In the end, this is Sigmund Kvaløy, who managed to organize a meeting between them, which gave hope for a dialogue, as Truls Gerson says. But what is the interesting part? According to Næss, some of the last things they spoke about before Zapffe passed away in 1990 was whether he has found an answer to the most burning questions for him. And here is Næss's answer. Zapfe's response was as long as his strength to talk allowed him. He was convinced that life continues to be a mystery for him. And I think that this kind of reflection upon Zapfe's philosophy is very illuminative for the way in which Zapffe himself understands the practice of philosophizing. This is a process of looking for never-ending questions. This is an endeavor, a search for meaning, which actually every human being, due to being a human, should continue and just make efforts not to stop.
What error would you say, or what error would perhaps Zapffe say we're making if we believe we have, completed a system, we finally found the answer, we've done philosophizing? What error are human beings making if they come to that conclusion that they're done?
I don't know what Zapffe would say, but for me, at least, probably I'm a bit prejudiced in this sense. I would think that it is hubris. Zapffe himself also writes about hubris. And I'm not really sure whether he writes about mistakes. He rather thinks that we should somehow think about philosophizing as a never-ending endeavor. And it's not pretty theoretical. I mean, it's a way of living. It's a life's philosophy, if I may coin it like that. So what is more important for him is somehow to pick up this kind of ontological tension and also try, in a sense, to point out the way of proceeding further and further, being aware that we will never reach the end. When a human being decides that they have reached the end, in both philosophical and existential terms, then there will be no philosophy, but more importantly, there will be no life as such. And I think that this is something like, if I may coin it, process ontology, because Zapffe hasn't had a very, very particular vision of building one non-controversial system. He's rather interested in building taxonomies. And probably later on we can discuss this kind of different types of taxonomies. Every single field regarding his investigations provides a particular type of taxonomy. We have taxonomy of pessimism, taxonomy of heroism, taxonomy of catastrophes, but all these kind of taxonomies, they are something like guiding systems which we as human beings should fill in with meaning. And the tricky point is that this meaning can never be fixed here and now, nor can it be fixed in the future once and for all. This is a matter of a process ontology which keeps all of us alive. If it makes sense.
It does make sense. It does make sense. But I guess it keeps us alive, but it keeps us alive within that Zapfian state where there's no nirvana. So it's constantly at the whim of the cosmic panic in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. There is nirvana, and the cosmic feeling of panic is something which we should develop all the time. And there is very interesting, but of course, probably we'll discuss this later as well. There is a very interesting condition which I somehow have tried to reveal in my work on Zapffe, that there is an idea, implicit, of course, idea of human unfixability. And this is this kind of tension of necessary tragic between the set of fixations. All the time we are trying to fix this kind of cosmic feeling of panic by adopting particular type of fixation mechanisms. But actually, we can never reduce the feeling of panic by choosing one or another fixation. And this is the gist of human unfixability as a matter of human nature. And that's why the question, what does it mean to be a human, is asked all the time. But not only it cannot find an answer, final answer, but it shouldn't find a final answer if we want to talk about humankind as such.
So you've defined the tragic fairly thoroughly, and we've sort of touched on Biosophy. But as these are it seems to me from your own book, from my reading of your own book, Biosophy and the tragic are really two key pillars to build up these taxonomies, this philosophy, this Zapfian philosophy. But Biosophy specifically allows us to enter into the more well-known discussions regarding Zapffer's philosophy of meaning and meaninglessness. So how would you define Biosophy, or I guess how would Zapffe define Biosophy to then move through into that discussion of whether or not, life has any inherent meaning?
Yeah, absolutely. Biosophy is a key, let's say, concept, because as I said, it could be used in different senses. And I think that it is Biosophy that helps necessary tragic to somehow mediate the understanding of the meaning of life. But Zapffe himself doesn't give a clear definition of Biosophy, and I think that this is a problem. He rather provides different descriptions, not even definitions, depending on the usage context. That is why we cannot argue for a Biosophy as a homogeneous concept again, but rather as a concept that develops in time by being embedded into different fields of Zapffer's investigations. I myself think that we can argue for Biosophy in different senses, as I mentioned in the beginning, as a method, as a theory, and as a philosophy. So probably the easiest way is to say a few words about Biosophy as a method, because this idea is discussed in the monograph on the tragic, and the adoption of this approach is influenced by Jakob von Uexküll's theory of biosemiotics, as I mentioned at the beginning, as displayed in the book Elements of One Biological Worldview, specifically in terms of Uexküll's ideas of Umwelt environment and the so-called developmental biology. So according to Zapffe, Uexküll's intention, and here I'll just briefly try to summarize, was not to revert developmental biology in the professional sense of the word, at least this is what Zapffe says, but only, and I quote, to evaluate the development of organic life from the perspective of the fight of interests. Specifically, the objective is not to burden poetry theory with the terminology of natural sciences, nor is the objective to narrow down the life of fantasy by imposing a biological dogma. And he gives a very interesting example, which I think somehow can illustrate this kind of strives for meaning. Zapffe argues that the method goes deeper as when one cleans up an attic. One puts boxes with art and poetry in one place, but on the other hand, one does not take a stance on their contents. Applied biology, however, cannot provide us with a final answer to the question, what does it mean to be a human? And it's obvious. So my intuition is that developmental biology can be described merely as being the content of the biosophical boxes, if we use this kind of metaphor, since the boxes themselves make human existential perspective possible. So on the one hand, we have the boxes, biosophical boxes, which make human existential perspective possible. And on the other hand, we have this kind of biological, let's say, content, which somehow gives meaning to this kind of abstract and formal boxes. And here, I refer to Hassan's theory, saying that in the monograph on the tragic, Zapffe gives preference to the term biological over biosophical, because biosophical, and I quote, has a mystical connotation which does not belong here. And this is the quote by Zapffe himself. In some later contexts, Zapffe adopts mainly the concept biosophical. And the difference between the two terms is not clear, as I said in the beginning, apart from the fact that biological, and here I quote, indicates something more empirical and less mystical than biosophical. And Hassan cogently points out that Zapffe argues for a biological or biosophical method, not for biosophy as such. Now, according to my interpretation, and probably it will sound a bit sophisticated, but it seems to me that biosophical and biological can be examined as methodological synonyms only in functional terms. What does it mean? They are mutually inclusive concepts that, however, are irreducible to each other. And this is their irreducibility that makes biosophy eligible for becoming an existential philosophy. So, on the one hand, what we can say for biological can be somehow referred to biosophical and vice versa. But biosophical is not equivalent to biological, because otherwise, at least in my point of view, biosophy should be considered as something similar to developmental biology, and this is against Zapfe's idea. So, in order to ground this hypothesis, I raise three arguments. The first is that as a main reason for the many interpretations of the relations between biosophical and biological, I point out the fact that Zapffe himself does not provide a clear distinction between biological, biologisk in Norwegian, and what he calls biologized, biologistisk. This is a third category with a very unclear status, and I have been trying, while reading on the tragic, to figure out what could be the relation between biological, biologized, and biosophical. Nor does he specify how such a distinction, if any, affects the development of biosophy. And a possible interpretation is that Zapffe assumes a certain difference of degree. Biologized is partly similar to biological, making room for the establishment of the biosophical as a method. What does it mean? It means that there is something like a third term between biological and biosophical. Otherwise, they could be quite different, and it would be difficult to figure out how they can interact in functional terms. The second point which worries me is what Zapffe understands by biosophical is more mystical than biological. And here it's important just to emphasize that mystical doesn't have to be interpreted as a matter of pure spiritualism, but rather as indicating the difficulties in specifying the reasons behind the term biosophical. Otherwise, encouraging spiritualism would have contradicted Uexküll's idea of environment, the one which I mentioned in the beginning, because environment is crucial for the justification of biosophy. And if biosophical is recognized as lacking substantiality, it would have put in question Zapfe's fundamental theory of the four interest fronts. What does it mean? If we are arguing about biosophical as more mystical, there is a risk biosophical to be understood in purely spiritual terms. But if so, then there would have been a gap between Zapfe's understanding of biosophical and his theory of the fourth interest fronts, because you remember that I mentioned biological interest front, social interest front, autotelic, and metaphysical interest fronts. So if we are arguing for biosophical as mystical, this would mean that we should underrate or even skip biological and social interest fronts. And this would be against Zapfe's conception. So these are the three speculations for which I have briefly pointed out for biosophy as a method. Now a few words about biosophy as a theory. So Zapffe determines the role of biosophy as concerning the case of dramaturgy, examining how dramatics should take place in the field, where, and I quote, life fights for its preservation and its development in one more or less favorable environment. And Zapffe defines the biosophical picture of the human condition in the world as an overall horizon. And here I quote again, regarding the expanded concrete courses where precious interests are entangled in a fight, so as they can make these courses a dramatic matter. And he specifies that biosophical view of a theme within dramaturgy discerns from both a metaphysical view, possibly from spiritual, materialist, vital, finalist, religious view, etc., and one speculative aesthetic overall view, which is indifferent but not necessarily polemically opposite. If these overall pictures, the metaphysical and aesthetic ones, are of such a type that, I quote again, unknown powers are adopted to make themselves valid by the natural laws and biological life, then the picture should have been built on the same material of observation. Thus, the difference would have been only in the way of interpretation. So, this vague, in many respects, excerpt, however, makes room for examining biosophy as related not only to the objective tragic, but also to the subjective poetic tragic in Zapffel's view. So when in the beginning you asked me about the role of tragic, I think that it's closely related with the introduction of subjective or poetic tragic. And it is biosophy that makes room for the introduction of this kind of tragic, as well as building a bridge between the objective reality consisting of these four types of interests and the world of art. So what I suggest very briefly as a possible interpretation is to see to what extent biosophy as a theory shedding light on the existential aspects of the two types of tragic, this objective and poetic tragic, can also shed light on how multifrontal interests lead to the introduction of the so-called multifrontal engagements. In other words, to explore how tragic is never driven by conflicts regarding one interest front alone. And the reason is that both the overlapping and the mutually exclusive interests trigger complex engagements, which are never biological nor metaphysical alone. And here I suggest that this complexity of engagements, which is underlined by the complexity of multifrontal interests, is the object of biosophy as a theory. And the third point, biosophy as an existential philosophy. Zapffe argues that biosophy means, and I quote, a philosophy, one theoretical view upon existence that is oriented towards biology and its annexes, paleontology, and which, in line with this, orients itself thoroughly empirically to all its problems. And in this context, biosophy is defined as, and I quote again, a way of thinking which is built on biology in a manner acknowledged by life. In a fanatical but necessary simplification, one can think about the first coming biosophical conclusion, all these are Zapffel's words, from the position of observation and introspection without being accused of adopting free and irresponsible fantasy. So I suggest that Zapffel's biosophy can be defined as an existential philosophy understood as a particular type of experiential philosophy, in order somehow to figure out what are the mutual relations between biosophy and biology. And I project them somehow on the level of the mutual ontological relations between existential philosophy and experiential philosophy. What does it mean? If biosophy is determined as an experiential philosophy, it can guarantee the normative validity of its own judgments as being rationally acceptable and deriving from the real matter at once, namely to be acknowledged by life without coinciding with life's matter as such. So these are probably my main concerns about the difficulties in defining biosophy. So if you want, we can discuss some things here and then continue with the issue of tragic.
Well, I think there's one of the sort of the final definition that you had there, that biosophy is being experiential, but honestly experiential from beginning with the biological. So a biological experience which is honest about its, perhaps existentially honest about its position as biology. That in turn, for me at least, was the key to this differentiation between meaning in life and meaning of life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that here, at least speaking in terms of influence, of course, Zapffe is very much influenced by Yuxkyo's understanding of environment. So basically, the idea of biosophy as a philosophical theory is grounded in the understanding that environment is not something purely physical. It is an arena of fight of interests, but at the same time, these interests, they are not purely physical interests. We have higher level interests, which on the other hand are inseparable from this kind of more basic interests. So when Zapffe has been trying to build up a philosophical paradigm, in a sense, he has been trying to keep the balance between this kind of material foundations in philosophical terms, on the one hand, and building something like a spiritual, so to speak, but not in the sense of mystical, let's say, roof of philosophical ideas, which can be broad enough so as they can somehow shelter this kind of philosophical, material philosophical ideas, but remaining irreducible to them. In this sense, if philosophy related to the biological foundations can be described as somehow as experiential philosophy, Biosophy is the one which makes this kind of experiential grounding a reason for building existential philosophy. Basically, experiential philosophy can be considered as a necessary and sufficient condition for building Biosophy as an existential philosophy, although being irreducible to it. And I think that's also an illuminative illustration of this ontological and methodological tension behind Zapffel's ideas and taxonomies in particular. And that's why I think that Zapffe himself is also very particular why he's arguing for Biosophy in different meanings. He never gives a final definition of Biosophy. These two definitions, I mean, some of the definitions which I read last are from his late writings. So basically, almost until the end of his life, he has been trying not to give a particular definition, but rather to use descriptions in order to reveal different aspects of Biosophy as a phenomenon, as a philosophical phenomenon. And at the same time, not to deprive this kind of philosophy from its experiential grounding and making it into a purely abstract theoretical construct. And I think that this is very important for his theory. He tries to combine material grounding with some kind of philosophical conceptualization by keeping the ontological tension between these two layers and trying somehow to implement this kind of ideas into different fields. Because interestingly enough, for example, one of the definitions of Biosophy is given, as I mentioned in the beginning, in this monograph, God's Kingdom, which is devoted to the historicity of Jesus. And the other one is somehow explicitly stated in his work on dramaturgy. So you see completely different genres, even in textual terms. So
there's something you mentioned there, which I think, just to draw it once again to The Last Messiah and to open up, because The Last Messiah is sort of simplistic. It doesn't include all this complexity. But you mentioned there an ontological tension, and I think this seems to me the point where the pessimistic view comes through from these two methodologies, is that the ontological tension between man as we've said, this questioning being with these four modes, in relation to like the limitations of the biological, is that the to get complex, the Uxkullian environment can't offer man the meaning that existentially he is looking for. So the world that we are within can never offer us what we actually sort of existentially require from it. Is that somewhat correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And also it's very interesting to see how some of the ideas as displayed in The Last Messiah have been developed in time on the tragic. And most of these ideas, which are somehow subjected to a particular philosophical development, are ideas which are related to this higher theoretical level, so to speak. Because in the beginning, he somehow discusses the idea, as you said, of Uxkullian environment, but then he tries to build new mechanisms, how to go beyond this kind of environment without being separated from it. And that develops this kind of complex fixation mechanisms.
Is he? Would you say he's successful in trying in going beyond that environment in any sense?
Of course, very much depends on what you understand by successful. I think that his theory becomes more and more complicated in theoretical terms, so as to provide some kind of specifications and clarifications, to multiply this kind of clarifications regarding the connection between environment and philosophical abstraction, so to speak. In purely, let's say, material terms, he provides more complex mechanisms, as well as building more specifications in terms of building relations between environment and, for example, the so-called autotelic and metaphysical interests. So the tension is getting higher and higher, and he's trying to reveal this kind of deeper and deeper connections between the environment, understood as biological and social environment, and autotelic and metaphysical environment, which is also called environment, but it has nothing to do with the material implications of Huxley's environment any longer.
Mm-hmm. So in relation to that ever-increasing tension between sort of seems to be our innate ability to search for existential meaning, but the innate ability of the environment to sort of never be able to give that, and that what you called earlier the process ontology, where that tension is ever increasing, that it seems there's two things happening simultaneously. That on the one hand, man will never be content, but on the other hand, if such was a possibility, that would actually be a bad thing in the Zapffian sense.
Well, what worries me in this kind of situation is how to place the cosmic feeling of panic related to the issue of human unfixability. Because the ontological tension behind unfixability is related to this amplification of cosmic feeling of panic. And I think that one of the climaxes of this amplification is the last Messiah. And it's also very interesting to follow to what extent the last Messiah addresses the humankind, but he somehow does not belong to this humankind, just because he is an interest bearer of two important interests, autotelic and metaphysical interests. That's why he's a Messiah. He's not an average person. So it's very difficult to figure out to what extent this kind of tension could be somehow reduced. And I think that it very much depends on a taxonomy of different types of people, which Zapffe introduces regarding tragic, because he has been trying to build a taxonomy of tragic people who are at the top of this kind of hierarchy. And these kind of people are the only ones who are able to realize that the meaning of life is unachievable. And regardless of this, they should continue striving for this meaning of life, although knowing that it's absurd. And I think that here we can probably draw a parallel to a certain extent, of course, very broad parallel between Zapffe and Albert Camus, the myth of Sisyphus. Because we had the same attitude towards absurdity as a strive for meaning, with the full awareness that the meaning in particular is unachievable. But regardless of this kind of strive for meaning is something which is never ending. And it is this strive that makes human beings what they are, full of tragic, of necessary tragic in Zapfe's term, of fragility, if you wish, existential fragility. And actually, this kind of strive is the essence of their nature. This kind of never-ending process of searching for meaning of life when knowing that the meaning itself is unachievable. Yeah.
How would you say Zapffe and Camus differ, though, in that respect, if there is a difference there?
Well, of course, they are very different in terms of the particular language they use. And I think that regarding Zapffe, when we discuss Zapfe's theory, of course, the idea of absurd, of what is meaning in life itself, is not so important because he have been trying to build this kind of taxonomy of humans as interest bearers. So basically, the conflict is an internal conflict which is driven by a different type of human nature compared to Sisyphus, because humans in Zapfe's sense continue to have this kind of plurality of interests. They have biological, social, autotelic, metaphysical interests. So they have different types of interests, and absurdity can be followed on multiple levels. While for Sisyphus, the strive for meaning and this kind of existential painfulness of realizing absurdity would be related mainly to, let's say, metaphysical and autotelic layer of Zapfe's taxonomy. If I manage to somehow set it in a clear manner, because for Zapffe, this is much more complex issue, and it is also somehow related down to earth, because he has been including biological and social interests as well. And these multi-frontal conflicts and the associated multi-frontal engagements are much more complex. They somehow affect all people. While in Camus' sense, the absurdities related to the, if I use or adopt or develop Zapfe's terminology, to autotelic metaphysical conflicts and the associated autotelic metaphysical engagements alone.
So staying with this, we have a huge foundation now to really address this key question, which is also, is then addressed in The Last Messiah. Well, it is more, I think, most clearly addressed in The Last Messiah. We have this cosmic panic, which as I understand it, is sort of perhaps the moment when I read it really quite poetically in a way of brief glimpses when fixations or identifications with certain modes of being or certain conclusions we've made are all stripped away, and we sort of completely feel ourselves in that. I mean, I think it's described perfectly, really, as that biological human being who's just completely. The universe is helpless captive, right? And so, is it simply then that from this foundation that we've made, that as we move through this process ontology and keep questioning what it is to be caught in this ontological tension, that any fixations that we abide by, be it, I don't know, nationality, job, anything even higher as well, metaphysical, all of these are simply means to basically stop ourselves actually going mad. They're all fantasies to try sort of delude ourselves away from being in cosmic panic.
Yes, absolutely. On the other hand, it seems to me that there is one very important specification regarding fixation mechanisms as panic means. They are somehow elaborated as means which should help us to cope with the feeling of panic. And here there is one important distinction which Zapffe makes between destiny and fate. Fate is something which does not depend on people, while destiny is something which humans as interest bearers control in a sense, due to what I said earlier regarding this kind of multifrontal conflicts, multifrontal interests, and so on and so on. So basically, I think that cosmic feeling of panic addresses human destiny rather than fate as such. And this is also a part of this process ontology, because we have this diversity of conflicts, diversity of engagements, and they are somehow mutually related in the way that they are in a constant conflict in between. When we have this kind of autotelic metaphysical conflicts, we cannot say which prevails, whether this is the autotelic or metaphysical. And consequently, the lack of this clearly articulated prevalence affects the associated engagements. We have autotelic metaphysical engagements, but we never know whether the autotelic element is dominating or the metaphysical one. And this makes this kind of internal complexity of human engagement with the universe. And this is what makes cosmic feeling of panic so fundamental for human beings. Because on the one hand, this is something which they cannot get rid of, so to speak. But on the other hand, it is exactly this kind of state of unfixability, which cannot be eradicated, that makes humans bearers of interests and having destiny, not only fate. So that's why I think that necessary tragic is what is constructive for humans, in the sense of making them aware that cosmic feeling of panic is something which they not only cannot get rid of, but they should not get rid of if they want to have a destiny, not a fate.
Well, I think so I didn't mention it at the start. This is going to be part one of our discussion, and then we've got a second part coming up, which I think the remaining questions that we've got are based more so around morality, ethics, specifically the pessimism, and then the notion of God and antinatalism. So, I mean, is there anything you'd like to add in the discussion that we've had today regarding, Biosophy, this sort of philosophical foundation that you feel is key to add in perhaps before the next discussion on morality and pessimism?
Yeah, maybe I would like to say a few words, if you allow me, about meaning of life and meaning in life, because in a sense they are quite related to the forthcoming issues regarding morality, philosophy of religion, etc. Just want to clarify this kind of concepts because it's very difficult to understand the rest. unless we have said a few words about them. So the origin of the meaning of life is also as tricky as Biosophy is. And that's why I want to say a few words about this. So the meaning of life as displayed by Zapfe's Biosophical perspective, again, can be traced on different levels. It can be traced back to Huxley's idea of environment and Berkeley's principle as percipi. So Zapffe argues that the traditional dualism between individual and environment is no longer so effective. And this is due to the introduction of Jakob Huxley's theory that the environment for a given species, even for the individual, is co-determined by the living being's perceptive equipment with respect to a possible inner elaboration of impressions. So why is so important? Because environment no longer is somehow set outside of human experience, so to speak. And it's very much related to the way in which individuals manage to build their identity. And here comes Berkeley's formula as percipi. So Zapffe interprets Berkeley's formula in a broader context in terms of identity. And the durability of Berkeley's thesis is tested from a point of view of percipi, from which one can understand esse without percipi. And in this very complicated way of arguing, we will see this kind of distinction between perception and essence, between existence and essence, as projected into different types of organisms in nature. Specifically, Zapffe claims that one has been constantly disproving Berkeley's thesis before one has managed to compare esse with perceptum to find the solution to the question of identity. And clarifying Huxley's intention, Zapffe argues the following: the biologist cannot work with anything but with perceptum. However, in the process of crossing many perceptions, so as one student of Berkeley or Huxley can adopt a perception in order to understand animals' perceptions, there is one first complication, namely that of perceptum est percipi. And Gundersen analyzes Zapfe's interpretation of SS percipi by focusing upon Zapfe's distinction between three types of environment. And it's also a very fundamental distinction, which is displayed on the tragic: hostile, satanic environment, indifferent and friendly environment for the beings. So according to Gundersen, when the experience of one piece of inorganic nature can be turned from hostile to friendly experience, the question probably is, what is this exactly? One meaningless question. Esse est percipi. So Gundersen argues that the question is meaningless, also in the sense that one cannot really gain confidence out of an experienced hostility. And here comes the problem with the meaningless of life. I would argue that analyzing the biosophical perspective of SS percipi shows that the meaningless of life cannot be softened by looking for an existentially insufficient meaning in life. These two concepts. What does it mean? Because it sounds, of course, quite complicated and sophisticated. First, I think that the starting point should be the biosophical perspective. So for Zapffe, the meaning of life makes humans realize their potential in different environments due to two factors that also affect other beings. The first one is the so-called equipment. And I think that is very important to be introduced at that stage. We have under-equipment, equivalence, or over-equipment of abilities and powers needed for the satisfaction of a need in an environment, according to Zapffe. And on the other hand, fixations, conditions, which vary from under-fixation, loss of control, loss of character when an environment is unfavorable to one's particular interest. Well-adapted fixation, bringing necessary stability, which shows a favorable degree of perfectibility, control of alternatives. And over-fixation, characterizing with stubbornness, ossification, together with wrong fixations. So on the one hand, when we are arguing about meaningless of life, on the one hand, we have an equipment, which is related to the abilities of the different individuals to deal with a given task. And they may have lack of equipment or surplus of equipment in terms of their abilities and powers. And on the other hand, we have this kind of fixations conditions. So for me, probably the wrong fixations are the most illuminative example of why it is necessary tragic, as triggered and experienced by highly developed tragic people. And these are the people who, as I said, are at the top of Zapfe's taxonomy of different groups of beings that determines the constructive potential of the cosmic feeling of panic. And I would say that the intrinsic value of human beings is that they produce fixations while their nature remains unfixable. And thus, they preserve their human condition by retaining the tension of asking, what does it mean to be a human? as a question which not only cannot get an answer, but also should not get a final answer, going back to what we discussed earlier. And one of the most important embodiments of this tension is the strive for meaning, when one assumes that getting a final meaning is meaningless in itself. So Zapffe himself says that a human is a being searching for meaning in a meaningless world. The second point, which I also want to briefly add, is related to the meaning of life and meaning in life, as well as whether they should be examined as refracted through Zapffel's ideas of heterotelic and autotelic aspects of meaning. And now this is a very broad topic, so I'll just briefly point out a few things. What is autotelic and heterotelic aspects? Because I believe that we should argue for aspects, not for heterotelic and autotelic meaning. First, I would just want to say that in Zapffel's theory, there is no such a thing as autotelic and heterotelic per se. So these are not self-sufficient categories. They are used in different senses. And I would point out that these senses are mutually related. So while autotelic aspects of meaning concern the objective of meaning in itself, this is self-sufficient meaning, heterotelic aspects of meaning address the objective of the meaning beyond this particular meaning. What does it mean? For example, biological interest may be defined as having autotelic aspects of meaning if it is examined from the perspective of the biological interest front alone. But when the same interest is examined, let's say, through the lens of metaphysical interest front, it has heterotelic aspects of meaning. And this is very difficult to be followed, but this is based on particular type of dialectics. For example, when we have biological interests and we argue for biological interest within biological interest front alone, this means that they are determined as having autotelic, self-sufficient aspects just because they fit the interest front they examined into. On the other hand, when you have one interest and it's examined into a different type of interest front, as is, for example, metaphysical front, it is not self-sufficient in terms of meeting the criteria of this new front. That's why it's supposed to have an objective or meaning beyond itself. Basically, that's why it's defined as a heterotelic. And it's a very long discussion. And of course, I'm not going into details, but just want to briefly say a few things. So I'm not going into detail about the discussion between Ness, Zapffe, and Herman Tönnes. And this is also one very interesting Norwegian philosopher who has, not only philosopher and psychologist as well, who has written the book Happiness is for the Pigs, also quite interesting book. So I'm not going about this discussion as displayed in the book I Choose Truth and the article Glimpse from the 30s and 40s. And for the Norwegian-speaking audience, so probably you'll be interested to read Roa Fremstedal and Inga Bustad's interpretation. They give a good overview of the problem. And for instance, Bustad discusses how Ness argues for a principle, a source out of life. According to Ness, such principles in life are the experience of joy and life satisfaction, which can make life meaningful as such. But Tönnes and Zapffe argue that once life is over, these experiences deteriorate. That is why the meaning of life as a whole, the meaning of existing, is absurd. And Zapffe himself says the following: I try to see the need for a meaning of life as an extension and derivation of the individual action. So my interpretation is a bit different. From a metaphysical perspective, the crucial questions about meaning in life illustrate how human beings are not able to grasp the whole complexity of the meaning of life, even though they elaborate upon different mechanisms of living with such a lack of meaning, namely the fixation mechanisms. So, regarding the functional connections between autotelic and heterotelic, as corresponding to this between meaning in life and meaning of life, Ness' criticism of Zapffel's meaning of life can be accepted only if, and here I adopt two concepts of the field from the field of logic, if one examines autotelic and heterotelic as contradictory terms. If one is false, the other is true of necessity. This means contradictory terms. Namely, it would mean that if autotelic is true, heterotelic is necessarily false. What does it mean? So Ness' criticism can be accepted as well-grounded only if one assumes that we have either an autotelic or heterotelic meaning regarding human lives and the existence of the world order. So, by contrast, I argue that the meaning in life and meaning of life can be examined rather as contrary terms, again, borrowed from logic. as heterotelic and autotelic aspects, not as autotelic and heterotelic meanings, because they cannot be true at the same time, but especially in the same sense. So that's why I think that when we are arguing that something is autotelic, at the same time, we cannot say that it can be heterotelic. But this does not mean, of course, that we cannot argue for autotelic and heterotelic meanings when applied in different senses, one and the same concept. So I don't support the thesis that the metaphysical lack of meaning of life in Zapfe's sense is absurd by default. It can be considered as absurd when it is investigated from the autotelic perspective of the world order alone, specifically if the world order is recognized as being a moral world order for its own sake. So I don't know whether it made much sense, but what I'm trying to say is that we cannot simply argue that Zapffe has some kind of absurdist theory. He rather tries to build particular dialectical relations between different aspects of meaning when related to the world order and humans in particular, rather than arguing for either autotelic or heterotelic meaning of the same concepts once and for all.
Okay, I think I understand that.
Very great if it is so sophisticated and complicated way of explaining. But as I said in the beginning, it's very difficult to read Zapffe. You should always struggle even with the smallest things in his writings because he's very complex, rich of ideas, meanings and stuff. So you should read him as if you are somehow solving a puzzle and you never know whether you're on the right track.
Mm-hmm. I think, yeah, that sounds like a very Zapffian approach, and you might never even solve the puzzle. But I guess to sort of wrap up there. Mm-hmm. So as I just said, this was part 1, so there will be a part 2 likely in a few weeks' time once this one has gone live. But I should ask, whereabouts can we find your book? I'll be sure to put the links in the description below for people who are interested.
You can send me an email, and if you're interested, I can just give you one of my author copies, because otherwise I'm not really sure whether it could be distributed abroad or so. But if you're interested, I can send you a copy, or I can just try to send you something like a preliminary version of my book online. I'm not really sure about the distribution abroad.
Okay. Well, unless there's anything else you'd like to add for this first discussion, Silviya Serafimova, it's been a great conversation.
Yes, thank you very much. I just want to say briefly, maybe 2 sentences regarding humankind's desire for meaning and whether it could be fully fulfilled.
Sure, yeah.
Just to wrap it up, I think that it would be a good end for our discussion, at least for this part. So it seems to me that if the desire for meaning is fully fulfilled, it would mean that humans have got a final answer to the question of what it means to be a human, and thus lose the unfixability to their human nature. And by getting a final answer, they are no longer humans, since they have deprived themselves of the necessary tragic and the associated cosmic feeling of panic. And in terms of meaning, the result is that one will accept that the meaning of life is autotelic meaning, a meaning in itself, which causes the transgression of the formula esse est percipi to that of percipi est esse by reducing human existence to human essence. And I think that this is the greatest danger for Zapffe, at least.
There we go. A very very Zapffian ending for this first
provocative part. Pessimism and quite tragic, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully we'll clear up some of that. Well, or maybe not alleviate, but delve deeper into that pessimism and then the possibility of sort of the antinatalism in the next part to continue this conversation. But yeah, great ending, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much.